at a conference speaking there. Okay, hello everybody. If anybody's at home, welcome everybody here at First Pres. We're in First Presbyterian Church of York. This is the third week of an ongoing adult ed class on peacemaking in the Middle East. Our church has had a history of thinking about peacemaking over the long years that my wife and I have been here. And so we're glad that the Christian Ed Committee wanted us to do a little bit with this topic. What we want to do today is we're going to do sort of two things. First, we're going to review a tiny bit about the stuff we did the first 2 weeks and have some conversation. If anybody has questions or comments or feedback, we'll talk just a little bit about where we've come so far. And then we're going to turn it over to Chris Clark. Chris, as you probably know, longtime member and leader at our church, actually went on one of these sort of learning experiences, I'll let him describe it, run by the Telos group, which is the group I recommended the very first week. I said, if you have a computer, go home and look up the Telos group, started by an acquaintance of mine and some other people who make peacemaking journeys out of a Christian orientation. They're a Christian organization, but they try to bring together Muslims, Jews, and Christians in the Middle East. They go to Israel and they listen to Israelis. They go to Palestine. They go to Gaza and the West Bank and do peace building operations so people can get to know one another better and so they can understand their religions better, motivated by the gospel's desire to have a Christian sense of peacemaking and understanding at least. It does not solve the macro problems of history, but they're making an effort. And their model seems to be working as they're also now taking it to other places where there are conflict and danger, South Africa and other places. So anyway, Chris actually was with one of those groups, and he'll tell you what he experienced, and so that'll be part of what we'll do today. But let's start off some time with conversation, but open with a word of prayer first. Can we do that? Triune God of the universe, we stand in awe of your goodness. We thank you for your creation. We thank you for your gospel. We thank you that Christ came and died and rose again, and in his resurrection power, you commission us to represent you in the world. And so we thank you, God, for this high and holy calling of being ambassadors of your kingdom. Help this class always nurture the hearts and minds of our community so we could be faithful to your task. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, here's what we want to do. I'm going to just highlight part of what I said the first week, and I'll ask for some feedback and conversations and questions. And that's going to be up to the time where we talked about the just war theory. Then we'll move into that conversation and ask if there's any questions about that. Then we'll do the third piece that Stephanie did, those videos, and we'll give an opportunity for people to ask her some questions. So the first thing I said, the very beginning, was just pretty simple, and I don't think there'd be any controversy here, is that we want to raise up, I used a verse from Chronicles, sons and daughters of Issachar. In the Bible, they were the people that understood the times and knew what God's people should do. And we said that's sort of a part of the motivation of our class, is trying to help us understand God's world and know what a Christian perspective is. There's people that know the times. There's people that know their Bible. But we're trying to bring those things together. I read some quotes from our Book of Confession, the reconciliation document in 1967 that talks about the lordship of Jesus as an agent of reconciliation over all things. It sounded like Colossians 1, that he made all things and he's wanting to reconcile all things back to himself and us to each other. So this vision of reconciliation, this vision that the Bible is in fact a light before our path, that we need to see things Christianly, not just sort of watch the news and then think about our faith and have some sort of divide between Sunday and Monday. No, as we vote, as we read the news, as we shop as citizens, as public figures at work or play, we do that all as Christians. And so part of the task of Christian education, as we see it in this church, is to encourage people to this whole life discipleship, where the scriptures are our starting point and Jesus is our goal and the kingdom is what we're about. That makes sense, right? So I gave some hymn tunes and some quotes about the incarnation. Any questions about any of that? The sort of generic picture of why Christians should care about current events as salt and light in the world. We use that metaphor too from Jesus. So we just did some generic teaching about being God's people in the world. Questions, comments, feedback? I got a couple notes from people saying they liked it. It seemed pretty basic, but that was good, right? Amen. Amen? Anybody want to say amen to that? You know, John Calvin is a founder of the Presbyterian tradition back in Geneva in the 1500s. And at one point, some historian called him a constructive revolutionary. I kind of like that. He was a revolutionary in many ways. Calvin believed the lordship of Christ included all areas of life, your personal life, your piety, your church, but also public life. But it was a constructive sort of revolution. He was trying to build the world into the institutions that we have, democracy and capitalism and all sorts of things. In many ways, go back to Calvin. So we Reformed people in the Presbyterian tradition make a big deal about our public theology, not just our hearts, but how it leads into faith and life in every area of life. Our church has a slogan about following Jesus everywhere. Well, whatever's hot on the news is one of the everywheres we got to address. So that's why we're doing that. Make sense? Okay, the next thing we did then is we shifted a little bit. As I said that one of the ways, there's others, but one of the ways in which the church has historically seen its public mission is to be agents of reconciliation, to be always working about conflict, to be the bridge between enemies, to be a witness for peace. And I didn't give a lot of verses about that, but I did hint at one thing that some people found a little interesting, and that's that in the Old Testament, military might, as the Old Testament unfolds, become increasingly an idol. And to the extent that Israel trusted their own self, they would actually lose their battles. And there's stories like Gideon where they had to cut the troops down and then cut the troops down even more and cut the troops down even more till they hardly had anybody. And he said, Lord, we can never win now. And he's like, right, now you got to trust me, go out. And they won the battle. Sometimes they took the praise teams out. Sometimes they took the lanterns out. The point was not by power, not by might, but my spirit, says the Lord, is Zechariah. Now that's an Old Testament, God's people in the Old Testament. Jesus comes along and says, I'm coming to fulfill that. So now you turn the other cheek. So being a peacemaker is part of what it means to be following in the ways of Jesus. The church has understood that, as I tried to explain, and then as Stephanie did as well, in two different ways. One way has been taking the turn the other cheek stuff. Literally, Mennonites and Quakers just say you're always committed to nonviolence. Think of Martin Luther King. You're always called to love others no matter what. The mainstream churches in America, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Catholics, don't believe that. They think, sadly, in a fallen world, sometimes you do have to go to war. And there's a debate within the church between those that are pacifists, committed to biblical nonviolence, or those that say, well, that's the ideal, but in a broken world, sometimes to protect others for the name of justice, you just have to pick up the sword. But from the 3rd century on, there's been conversation and agreement, St. Augustine in the 3rd century, up to Aquinas in the 6th century. They've always thought that if you go to war, you can only go in very limited times when you've tried every other option, and certain ways in which you fight. You can't kill civilians intentionally, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's called the just war theory. And I suggested that that was a model for what at least most Presbyterians would say, yeah, if you have to fight in the right way and in the right style, and stop as soon as you can for a ceasefire. Diplomacy always wins out in the many principles of the complicated just war theory. There are whole books, there are whole classes. The Army War College in Carlisle teaches whole classes on the just war theory. So this is not a class on that, but I wanted to introduce it as one tool to say that we can say with, I think, confidence that Israel has violated the just war theory in the recent attack of Gaza, that they've intentionally targeted homes and buildings and hospitals and mosques, and and the culture at large, the infrastructure and so forth, which you're not supposed to do when you're fighting ethically. In the past, Israel has prided itself of being a nation that tries to do the right thing sometimes. And I was reading a narrative just last night of a journalist who was, for Fox News, who was in Gaza years ago in the first uprising and saw a number of people killed in the morgue. And the Israeli defense team said, no, we didn't kill anybody in the morgue. We killed one. We took out one guy with a missile shot. We have the video to prove it. Just one guy died. She said, I was in the morgue. I saw dozens and dozens of dead bodies and hundreds of people in the hospital. Not hundreds, dozens and dozens in the hospital. And she said, I saw them with my own eyes. And she went back to somebody in Israel and said, I saw these people. The Gazans are not making this up. And they watched the video close, and they watched it over frame by frame, and they found out that, in fact, dozens of people, in fact, were killed. And her take was that Israel was surprised by this. They said, we tried not to kill civilians. So it wasn't, in that era, this was 20 years ago, intentional, and they were sort of surprised that they took out so many civilians. Well, now, of course, they know. Everybody knows. So that was the second piece we talked about. Questions, comments, feedback. Anybody want to say anything about all that? Please. Concerns, questions? Betty.
Just the question of the fact that the enemy, quote, of Israel right now hides behind civilians and in hospitals and in residential areas and in
Yeah. Did everybody hear her question? Right now, Hamas and others, and this has happened in other terrorist wars as well, hide in hospitals, in part because they've all been forced into the Gaza Strip, which is a tiny area, so everybody lives forced together, some of them in refugee camps. So it is a very crowded area. But yeah, the just war theory has always developed in an era when battles were fought out usually in the countryside between two armies, and they say, okay, you don't go into the cities and kill people. Then with urbanization, it became more complicated, and now, we have people bombing cities. Hiroshima or the firebombing of Dresden or whatever. So it's not new, but it's particularly thorny, and the just war theorists are trying to figure that out. Some would say, deeply Christian people trying to follow the historic logic, say those old principles just don't work anymore because the enemy is in civilian areas. And so part of the just war theory is you can't intentionally kill civilians. If you're going after the bad guys, and there's collateral damage, they may say that is just part of the price of war. Now, those of us that are committed to biblical nonviolence want to say, oh, that's not right. You can't do that. But the just war theorists are trying to slice it in a way where they would say, we're trying to be as ethical and right as we can, but collateral damage, if it's unintended, even if it's expected, but it's not knowingly or not, the goal isn't to kill the civilians, but if there may be some collateral damage, so they would say sort of the ends justify the means in that sense. Now, I don't know what I think about that, but that's it. They're working on that. There are people that would say we got to be more careful. Please.
This just war theory is just a theory.
Uh-huh.
Because if you look at all the wars through history, very little of that is ever applied. World War
Yeah.
I,
Yep.
Germans used
Yep.
gas. World War II, we bombed Berlin.
Yep.
And the cinders.
Yep.
And there are multiple wars
Yeah.
where you can show that theory has not been applied.
Yeah. Yep.
And therefore, it's really just a theory.
Yeah, a theological principle. Yep. Everybody hear that? Now, here's an interesting thing. There's great conversations between Mennonites and Brethren who are biblical pacifists. They think you take Jesus literally on this, and the Reformed and Protestant traditions and Catholics. And often the Mennonites say, you Protestants that believe in this just war theory, you're just using that as a way to help the world do its unholy, dirty business, and we should hold our ground and say, no, Jesus says no. And they often have that come up in conversations like, tell us one war that was ever stopped by the just war theory. And so you got a good point there. Well, that's interesting. Down at our bookstore, we have a book on American history where they took a bunch of theologians who believe in the just war theory, and they're historians, and they evaluated every war in American history and said, did they try diplomacy first? Did they try peace treaties first? Was it the last effort? Did they fight it well? Did they kill civilians? And these guys evaluate every war in American history War of 1812, etc. So it's just interesting that the just war theory folks are struggling with that very question. It's a legitimate critique that has never, hardly ever worked. Although some people would say, well, without the just war theory, we would have just wiped them out to smithereens. But we restrained ourselves because we thought that was wrong. So we tried, at least in America, we've tried at some point to have some ethics, and increasingly so now, people are talking about that.
Glenn Stassen, who's
Glenn
passed
Stassen.
away, who's a great Christian ethicist.
You studied with him.
Yeah, I did. And he talked about how you can sort of pinpoint when World War II changed. And that was when we started doing bombings.
Of the cities. Yeah, the Germans were doing that, and we said, we're never going to do that. We're civilized. We have certain constraints. We're not going to start bombing cities. And Germany was doing it, and we didn't. And then eventually the firebombing of Dresden, targeting.
It didn't really tear down the morale of people.
It didn't.
Yeah. The other thing is that one of the just war theories is it has to be winnable. You have to show that it's actually winnable.
Yeah.
To go into a war not understanding that it's possible, that it's winnable, which is a whole other question about how you assess
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
What does winning mean? I mean, it's very complicated.
Yeah.
That's why it's a theory.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
It's very complicated to try to figure that out going into a war, whether it's winnable.
Yeah. Real quick.
Yeah, I'm glad you said all this because it still made it more clear in my mind because I was kind of thinking of that stuff last week, what you were saying, but you're clearer on it than I am.
Okay.
And, it is really difficult, and some of my family are Mennonite, and I just don't get on this stuff,
And you've been Presbyterian forever, right?
Why?
You've been Presbyterian forever. You.
I have been,
Yeah.
but
You have relatives who are Mennonite. Nice.
my great-grandfather
Yeah.
was on one side.
Nice.
They're all Mennonite, Swiss
Yeah.
Mennonite. And, I just don't get into it,
Uh-huh.
with
Yeah.
anybody because I'm not trying to win, I'm just trying to have a
Understand. Your relatives, sure.
But I just think some things they say,
Yeah.
I want to say,
Yeah.
you are living the way you have been living and wanting to live.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, because we, of our wars,
Yeah.
sometimes in what we do,
Yeah.
and they wouldn't be living like they do
Yeah.
now if we just
Yeah.
said, okay, well, we'll just let it up to God
Yeah.
and stuff, that's easy
Yeah.
to say.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
sometimes you have to, like you say,
Yeah.
it has to be the right way.
Now, for what it's worth, the Mennonites who are committed to following Jesus in the way of Jesus around this nonviolent stuff, like Martin Luther King before them, would say, let the chips fall where they may. If we're arrested, we're arrested. If we die, we die. We've got to be faithful to Jesus. That's the first thing. When we used to have the peacemaking initiative here during the nuclear war years, people would say, well, what about the Russians? And I would say, that's a good question, but the big question is, what about Jesus? That's the first question. What do we think as followers of Jesus the church should be about? What about the Bible? That's the first question. Then how you live that out in the practical complications of the messy human history we live in, that's a secondary question. It's a legitimate question, but it's not the first question. The first question, I think, should be, what about the Bible? What about our Christian tradition? What about theology? What about Jesus? Once we're clear on that, then we can try to figure out how in the Word you live and what price you pay and what goes on. Within the just war theory, even, there's debates. Some people would say, are you ever allowed to kill, like to protect yourself? Self-defense is the only thing. And some people would say, oh no, the Bible never says you can kill to protect yourself. You're not your own. You own to God. You could maybe kill to protect somebody else. As an agent of doing justice for the victims, you may have to set in to help others. You can't protect your own darn self. The Bible never says that. Other people would say, oh no, you can't get involved in the killing people for the sake of justice. That's stupid. But you can for self-defense. So even in the just war theory, where they sometimes think some violence is necessary, they would disagree about when and for what reason. So it's complicated. We need to have a whole class on this. In terms of the Middle East, any specific questions, though, about Israel and Gaza now that anybody wants to share about the kind of stuff we've been talking about? Just want to have an opportunity for feedback, for conversation. Has anybody other than Chris in our church been to Palestine, in the West Bank or Gaza? Has anybody been to Palestine? I've never been. Anybody been in a war zone? you ever fight in a battle? Yeah. Well, we're going to keep talking as we go on. Questions for Stephanie about those videos we showed. Real quick, she showed 2 great videos. Anybody have any questions about those from last week? She didn't make the videos, so she may not be able to answer. But she picked them. Steph, want to say anything about those?
Well, just a real quick reminder, or for those who weren't here last time, an encouragement to go back and watch them. We watched a 10-minute video that gave a concise overview of the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict over the last 100 years or so, starting in the aftermath of World War I. And then we watched a second video that was put out by a group of Methodists from their mission office, interviewing various Christians who live in Palestine, talking about what their life is like. And I think it was interesting to hear those varied experiences. And if you didn't have a chance to watch those, I think they're helpful to see. So,
The history of the Middle East in 10 minutes.
in 10 minutes.
Everybody's worth there, folks.
They do talk fast, so you can go back and rewatch it. But yeah, what was your takeaway from either of those? Any comments? Any thoughts? If not, we can certainly let Chris share with us.
All right, good morning. I think I need to begin with a disclaimer that's kind of like that old commercial. You know, I'm really not an expert on this topic, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express once, so that's pretty much what you got. But I had the opportunity to visit Israel. I had the opportunity to visit Israel a number of times back in 2015, 2016. When I was with Dentsply, we were actually evaluating and then purchasing a dental implant company in the far north of Israel. And during one of those visits, I was able to arrange a tour, a one-day tour of Jerusalem and Bethlehem through Telos, along with a colleague of mine, that I think I started by saying it was a top 5 day of my life, but then I got thinking about it saying, wait a minute, I married the most wonderful woman in the world. I've got 3 wonderful kids, great birth dates, remember that, one of which is married, really nice guy. So it's getting bumped to the top 10 as opposed to the top 5, but it was a pretty amazing day. Want to start a little bit with just a real quick refresher on Telos. We're not going to get into a ton on them, but this group is focused on really education and dialogue. They kind of position themselves as pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. And what I found was the day that they set up for my colleague and I was just really deeply educational. I wish I'd taken notes. I tried, when I got back to the hotel, I tried to bang out as many as I could. But, you know, quite frankly, it was really incredible. We were jointly led by an Israeli tour guide, Sarah, and also a Palestinian tour guide, Iyad. There's a picture of Iyad with the Cubs cap on. Great choice, by the way. And we spent the day, they picked us up at 7:30 in the morning, and we finished at about 10 o'clock at night, seeing the most amazing sights. And I could spend a couple hours separately showing you through and talking about the Garden of Gethsemane, which was fantastic, or the experience walking the Via Dolorosa, where, you know, Christ walked, and some of the surprises we encountered along the way. And, you know, Jesus said that, you know, the widow with her little coins, the coins were there, they said, they promised. But, you know, what I would say, the 2 highlights of the day that Telos put together were being able to sit down and talk with individuals from both sides of the conflict, both on the Israeli side and also on the Palestinian side, and to hear their stories, to hear their fears, to hear their hopes. One was with a Israeli rabbi, and the other was with a Christian Palestinian minister. And so, you know, I'm going to talk primarily through those 2 experiences, but then also some other insights, if you will, or experiences I had during that visit and several other visits over there. First, I had the opportunity to have a Shabbat lunch at the home of an American-Israeli rabbi, Rabbi Laux and his wife. So we're in their home. Again, it was just the four of us, my colleague and I, and Rabbi Laux and his wife. He was a young executive in St. Louis with famous bar department stores and felt God's call to become a rabbi. And he moved his young family with 3 little kids to Israel, trained to become a rabbi, and that's what he was doing. Had some really interesting discussion relative to his view of the situation, including the fears they had putting their young kids on public transportation to go to school during the second intifada when they're blowing up buses, okay? And just, how formative that and how challenging that is, but how they were committed to this. They were committed to peace, et cetera, through this. And again, I wish I'd taken notes on both of these discussions more than I did. For both of them, while they were clearly advocating one side, I remember coming away feeling that they were actually far more balanced and pragmatic than what I had anticipated, okay? Relative to Rabbi Laux, he identified factors that contributed to the problem from both sides, and I'll kind of highlight some of that. He also, and actually the Palestinian minister also, both had a theme that the dehumanization of the other side was a significant issue, okay? When we begin to think about them as the other, as opposed to actual humans with actual hopes, actual fears, et cetera, that's a trigger. And so they both identified behaviors on both sides that contributed to that dehumanization, which was interesting. Rabbi Laux is personally an advocate of the two-state solution, but as I recall, I think he felt that the two-state solution was more challenged to gain broad acceptance when there were so many security threats and groups that were focused on the total annihilation of Israel as a state. And if you think about the current situation where the stated goal of Hamas, which is for practical matters the governing authority in Gaza, their stated goal is Palestine free from river to sea. And they don't just mean a free state, they mean free from Jews. And so, again, that feeling when you're in an island, okay, surrounded by groups or peoples or nations that seek to annihilate you, not only don't want you there, they don't want you. Again, that mindset is extremely challenging, Rabbi Laux felt, to get broad Israeli acceptance, if you will, to a two-state solution. That needed to be somehow broken down, if you will, to move forward. And that had largely existed all the way back going back to 1948 when Israel was established. Okay, so again, this is not a new mindset that they're challenged with. This has been around for quite a while. He also felt that the Israeli form of government was particularly a challenge, if you will, to finding middle ground. And Israel has what they call a parliamentary democracy. And I apologize, this slide is small, so I'll try to explain it. But there are a bunch of different, back up. There are a bunch of different political parties. We've got 2 real ones, right? Democratic and Republican. They've got 10, 12, 14, 16, depends on the election cycle. And if someone doesn't like what they want, they form a new party and they just move. So long and the short of it is, what happens here is whoever can build a coalition that has a majority of the seats, they become the prime minister, essentially. And so the 2 dominants are, on the right, Likud, which is where Netanyahu is, and Labor, which is now called Zionist Union, which is a little bit more progressive, on the left. So what Rabbi Laux, he said, look, there's a lot of good things about this, okay, in that because there's so many parties, there's a lot of voices at the table. But the challenge is, in order to govern, you've got to basically compromise to get half. And so as such, unless the 2 big ones, which are relatively far apart, figure out how to get together, they're essentially pandering, if you will, to, or having a compromise to the far right or the far left. That means that a large movement, either way, is to the middle, is relatively difficult, all right? So again, he was pretty open in terms of saying, this is a bit of a challenge if we can't get our two major parties on the same page, if you will, in terms of how to handle this.
Hey, Chris, can I just ask a real quick question?
Fair.
Did he look down on this parliamentary model in part because he was an American?
It's possible. As I recall, he did highlight that there's some issues with ours, right? As we clearly are now. We're deadlocked, right? I mean, we're in gridlock. But I think they're able to move, so that's easier, but they're not able to move to the middle as easily, okay? I think was what I took away. And again, I didn't have notes, and this is now, 9 years ago. But at the end of the day, I remember coming away going, boy, that was a rather frank discussion in terms of some of the systemic challenges, if you will, to finding a middle ground here, okay? I also remember, though, that he was tremendously hopeful relative to younger Israelis and the younger generation, okay? And he really felt that some of these internal Israeli barriers potentially could be broken down in the next generation. I then had the opportunity to have a couple hours of coffee with a gentleman by the name of Mitri Raheb. And Mitri is a Palestinian Christian theologian. He is the head of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Palestine. He's the founder of Dar al-Kalima University in Bethlehem. That's where he is. He's written a ton of books on the Palestinian cause, if you will. And at the time, he was on Mahmoud Abbas's advisory council. Abbas, at the time, actually I think still is the head of, or the president of the Palestinian Authority, which governs basically West Bank. Does not used to cover Gaza, but was not really governing, and that's when Hamas kind of took over. So Mitri's pretty influential, and we had a couple hours with him. And again, as I mentioned, he's written extensively on the conflict from the standpoint of being a Palestinian Christian. He also is strongly in favor, or was a strong advocate for a two-state solution. One of his key themes is that the Jewish settlements, particularly in the West Bank, are really an exacerbating problem that complicates this, that complicates the prospects for peace moving forward. And I've got some additional thoughts and a couple pictures on that, what I'll share here coming up. But as I recall as well, what he was most vocal about were the issues of Israeli policy that impact the peace prospects, particularly relative to human rights and the dehumanization of the Palestinian people, the control over things like water, which I'll get into here in a minute, et cetera. So again, things that have people come away feeling like they're less than fully human, they're less than equal, they're less than. That's a real issue, and that's got to be ultimately got to be addressed. That said, he also had some valid concerns about the shortcomings on the Palestinian side, and in particular, the ability of the Palestinian Authority to govern. The challenge, I mean, you think about it, the PLO, this Palestinian Authority essentially came out of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which, some would view as a terrorist group early on, okay? And then they had to figure out essentially how to govern. He kind of took away from Mitri that they were still kind of figuring out how to govern. And absent that, it creates a vacuum. And you can kind of see where in Gaza, that vacuum now has been filled in a not so great way, all right, if you will. So again, he was relatively clear in terms of, there are issues on both sides here. The other piece is that, and I would say back on the settlements, he viewed the settlements really from a mindset of empire and colonization. And if you think about some of the themes in the Middle East going all the way back in the biblical period in terms of empires and colonization, et cetera, this land has been colonized and recolonized, many times. So that is a lens that, again, Palestinians tend to view this issue through. Both Mitri and Rabbi Laux, without naming it, really hit on, in my mind, the dangers of ideology. Okay, the dangers of putting a cause someone believes in ahead of the humanization of the other. again, that was really a common theme. A few more takeaways relative to the. Let me start with the visit to the West Bank and the settlements. Again, I think the existence and expansion of the settlements are certainly a significant complication to the peace process. Not only is there the issue of the land itself, okay, and again, but you've also got a clear divide here in the context of. I mean, first off, there were cranes everywhere. Okay, I mean, you could drive by and there was a lot of building going on. All right, you drive by and you see, up on the hill, there's an Israeli settlement. But then you look and, about another half-mile away is basically a Palestinian area, largely underfunded, a lot of which didn't have windows in a lot of the buildings, et cetera. So you've got a clear socioeconomic, challenge, if you will, in terms of the Israeli settlers and their Palestinian neighbors. In addition, the security elements that are put in place then to support the settlements create a lot of complications and hardships for the Palestinians, because there are roads connecting them. So in order to you gotta basically, some of those roads, are just totally closed off to Palestinians, fences, et cetera, barbed wire in some cases. And others, they can cross or they can utilize them, but only after going through pretty significant checkpoints. So Dimitri, the day after he met with Jean-Michel and I, mentioned that he had a meeting with the advisory council and Abbas in Nablus. Nablus is 50 miles or so as the crow flies. And he said it was going to take him over 3 hours to get there because of the route he had to take and the number of checkpoints he had to count on going through. Okay, so just everyday life can be, just really kind of a hassle as a result of all this. Beyond the settlements, there's also provocateurs on either side, okay? And inside, so Old Jerusalem set up into 4 quarters, okay? There's a Christian quarter, Muslim quarter, an Armenian quarter, and a Jewish quarter. And inside the Muslim quarter of Old Jerusalem, which, by the way, butts right up against the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the site where we as Christians believe both Golgotha and Jesus' tomb are located. There are houses in this Muslim quarter that have been intentionally purchased by right-wing Israelis to essentially, expand their territory, expand collective claim to territory. So again, picture we're going in, and when they go in, I circled it, that's a guardhouse, okay, that is now, typically manned with somebody up there from a security standpoint to keep that Israeli house in the middle of this large area. Again, it's just challenging, right? And it just doesn't help with the general tone. I mentioned things like water. Water's a real issue. There isn't much of it, and what is pretty tightly controlled. If you look at it, this was something I pulled off the internet just this week. But Israelis, you see the consumption of Israeli individuals per capita, and you see where the Palestinians are, which is really below what the World Health Organization would, recommends as needed for, basically healthy survival. All right, it's tightly controlled, and it's not cheap. Security, okay. You sense even before you get there, even before you get on the plane to go there, you're going, you're not going to, Miami or Seattle or something like that. You've got multiple checkpoints to get through. They'll check your laptop, 3 or 4 times to make sure, see if it's been altered in any way, et cetera. And certainly when you land, there are Israeli army with machine guns pretty much everywhere around Ben Gurion airport. That's pretty routine. Even in the cities, when you're walking around, you will see a very strong security presence. There's a large area in the customs area at Ben Gurion where Palestinian Arab passengers will wait, and sometimes for hours, to be permitted entry. Mitri typically flies out of Amman, Jordan, when he needs to fly because it's easier for him, despite the fact it's like 5 times the distance. But it's also uncomfortable for Israelis, all right? We stayed in Tel Aviv, and there had been a terrorist attack, a knifing, on the Tel Aviv boardwalk about a month before we got there. And so as a result, I mean, there was police presence and literally checkpoints everywhere there that also Israelis had to go through. We had a dinner in the Palestinian section of Tel Aviv, which is called Jaffa, which is really the old Arab section. And we had a problem in that, by the time we finished dinner, it was a fabulous evening, but no cab would come that late into the Arab, in the Arab section to bring us back to the hotel. So we ended up walking, about 3 miles, which was really no issue. It didn't particularly seem unsafe, but again, just challenges in terms of security and daily life. Life challenges. The general situation, the tensions, even before the current conflict, created really, again, a number of life challenges. As I mentioned, we had both an Israeli and a Palestinian tour guide. We spent most of the day with the two of them together. Obviously, the Palestinian did not join us for the Shabbat lunch. And the Israeli tour guide could not join us. By the way, another meant to show this on security. That wall is real, okay? I mean, that wall is, you're driving on the interstate, and they're equivalent of the interstate, if you will. And you can see it, for miles right alongside you. Again, it just reinforces, the question of others, if you will. And obviously, we've got challenge of that in our own country. The signs of, Area A, those are real, okay? Our Israeli tour guide could not come into Bethlehem. Bethlehem's part of the Area A, and it's not lawful for her to be there. So, again, kind of a challenge. We also had a dinner, I back up. Before I get to that, the Israeli, you need in order to be a tour guide in Jerusalem, you need to have a license, okay? The Israelis' license was essentially free. The Palestinians was the equivalent of $20,000, okay? $20,000, okay? So to give you again, life is just, it's just challenging. The proximity of the tensions. Okay, this is a small country, and it is all, the tensions are close. Okay, so all Israelis have to do some type of military service, which means that most families have very close ties to people who are actively in the military. And there's a definite feeling among the Israelis that they're on a small island, if you will, surrounded by hostility, okay? And that's a mindset that, they live with every day. Again, recognize that most of their neighbors want them not just not here, they want them gone, all right? And again, that's you internalize that day in, day out, you're feeling like another as well. So again, this really goes both ways. We had, for an interesting story, we had a dinner, as I mentioned, the business we bought was way in the north of Israel. And we had a dinner at a restaurant that was about 300 yards from the Blue Line. The Blue Line is the demilitarized zone between Lebanon and northern Israel. And it's probably one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. And, when we kept getting closer and closer, I'm kind of getting a little nervous. And Don, the president of the company we were purchasing, so I was getting nervous. He said, "Oh, Chris, don't worry." He goes, "You're in the safest place in the world right now." He goes, "Everything will just go over our head." So again, they live with this tension every day. We talk with an individual who was not part of this company, but part of another dental startup, who had rockets. He lives in Ascalon, which is just over the line from Gaza, and he's had rockets land in his front yard, okay? Again, it's just, they just live with this every day. This is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, believed to be built on the site of Jesus' birth. And what you can see here, there's some bullet holes in here. And the bullet holes on the side of the Church of the Nativity came during some of the action of the Second Intifada. Okay, so again, it's just there's marks of this a lot of places. What I want to comment on here, though, is I want to use the church to highlight that there are heavily fractured relations between the Christian denominations. Okay, so this is the big conflict is Jewish and Islamic, right, or Arab and Palestinian and Israeli. But we as Christians are not unified in terms of what we're doing, either externally coming in or even the Christians on the ground there. So let me give you a couple of examples here, and this really surprised me. The Church of the Nativity is split between Armenian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox. So it's one church, and it's essentially split right down the half. They've got two altars, they've got two of it, and again, they really, from what I can tell, don't talk a whole lot about to each other. The Roman Catholics built this brand new, beautiful church physically exactly right next door. But they weren't allowed in. They built it because the Armenians and the Greeks said, no, we're not going to let you in and have part of ours, okay? So they built this thing next door, and they built a tunnel to get in between, okay? That's the tunnel. Well, they blocked, so the Armenians blocked, and the Greeks blocked the tunnel, and now the compromise is the tunnel's only open for like 2 hours in the morning before the rest of the church is open. Okay, so the Roman Catholics, if they want to come in and have their thing, they're allowed. I don't know, it's like from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. or something like that. But it's just a bizarre deal. Okay, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, again, which is believed to be the site of Golgotha and Jesus' tomb, is even more bizarre. It's split 4 ways. The Roman Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, and the Egyptian Coptics. Okay, all have a fourth. Well, the Catholic and the Greek Orthodox have the lion's share. The Coptics and the Armenians is small. The Coptics actually have where they believe the site of the tomb was. Okay, which is kind of neat. But anyway, but the keys to this church are held by 2 Muslim families because the 4 denominations can't agree as to who should be in charge. Okay, so again, it's just a little bizarre. And then you get into some a current situation. So Mitri's church, Mitri's no longer the pastor of that church. He's moved on, or he's still in the area, but there's a different gentleman, Muther Isaac, who has also written quite a bit on this, who is the pastor.
He was in the video we saw last week.
Yes. Well, this is the creche that they had in that church over December. And essentially, what you've got is you've got Jesus lying in rubble, baby Jesus lying in rubble, with a keffiyeh, I think is the way you pronounce it, which is the headband, if you will. And what they did is, it's not just any headband, it's not just any keffiyeh, it's the keffiyeh in the black and white checkered, which is basically what Arafat wore, and unfortunately what a large number of the Palestinian terrorists, or the Arab terrorists, if you will, back in the 70s and 80s wore as well, when they were hijacking planes and whatever else. So this is unfortunately, in some ways, it's a very provocative symbol, right? And this has caused a fair amount of stir, if you will, on the Jewish side relative to just, again, the image. It'd be the equivalent of wrapping Jesus maybe in a Confederate flag. I don't know, but the point being is, it's just challenging. I would also raise, before I close here, the ideology thing. This is the March issue of Christianity Today, and it's overall pretty balanced. Maybe a little more pro-Israeli because they're specifically talking about the situation of October 7th. All right. But, give you a point here, I'll just read this a little bit. In an audio file intercepted by the Israeli Defense Forces from October 7th, a Hamas terrorist called his parents from a kibbutz just down the road from Kfar Aza, and this was written, the lead-in was about this particular kibbutz, Kfar Aza. saying, and the individual said, look how many I killed with my own hands, he says. Your son killed Jews. Little later he adds, Mom, your son is a hero. His mother says, I wish I was with you. So we got a long way to go, obviously. And again, there's two sides. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong. Everybody's right, everybody's wrong, okay? Like most things in life. But I do believe that Telos is onto something here, that establishing dialogue, recognizing that this issue is multi-sided, that both sides have right or wrong, educating us in terms of finding balanced, fact-based approaches, challenging us as Americans to get involved in the dialogue, that we must play a solution moving forward, and doing everything we can to humanize the situation and to remove the barriers that dehumanize, I think are really, really important. I do want to leave with one picture. I never thought I'd see this. Okay, this is Sarah and Iyad. Okay, so again, I do hold out hope that in the younger generations, hopefully they're, that Jesus can somehow redeem all this. So.
Can you tell us again?
Yeah, Iyad's the Palestinian on the left, and Sarah is the Israeli tour guide on the right. Okay, so. All right. Questions? Yeah, any questions? Yeah.
Did you get to see Jesus' tomb?
Yeah, I did. Yes. So again, it's so Jesus' tomb is in the same church that the site of Golgotha, or the cross, was. And you work your way through, and they've got 5 or 6 sites in there that are amazing. But specifically, the tomb, it's in the Egyptian Coptic section. So you go into that. I have the pic. I don't have it here, but I'd be glad to, if you send me your email, I'll be glad to send you one. If you got it. Inside, it's inside. It's down. It's very dark, and you get like one. You got to move fast because there's big long lines, etc. But it was pretty moving. The other thing was interesting is the site of the nativity is also down below. It was in a cave, and they really believed that the stable was actually a subterranean location. So
When you were talking about the void that was left in Palestine, it's been filled, you mean filled with Hamas?
in Gaza, correct. So the Palestinian Authority has largely been governing portions of the West Bank, but realistically, and in part, maybe the challenges of trying to govern, frankly, 2 different disparate territories that are not, physically attached, with all the challenges of, getting back and forth and, with Israeli control in between. But, again, for whatever reason, that you could argue the Palestinian Authority had not been particularly effective in terms of governing in Gaza. And in that vacuum, Hamas essentially has stepped in as really the governing authority. And Hamas's ideology is obviously far more, antagonistic towards Israel than even what the Palestinian Authority would be. So that's certainly a challenge. Other questions?
When you were going through the checkpoints, did you have to wait a long time?
Yeah, so the checkpoint was probably about a 10-minute process, coming through. They had mirrors which they looked under the car with. They checked the trunk. They checked my briefcase. They obviously checked my passport. But it was, they were thorough. I didn't feel unsafe, but I certainly, felt they were being careful, as well they should.
One of the concerns that many Palestinian citizens have, and this was a little bit in the video that Stephanie showed last